Hey, welcome back to It's Just ADHD. Today, we're going to be talking about special interests, what causes special interests, and what makes our brains different. Like, why are we drawn to these things? Why does it take over so much of who we are? Why can't I let these things go, Tara?
So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin. Yeah, let's get into it. Obviously, a lot of autistic people have special interests. I would say some ADHD people do have special interests as well, and I don't even know if it's a meaningful distinction at this point now that the research is showing more and more that a lot of people have both, autism and ADHD. So just know that this episode we're mostly talking about autism research, but then there's also some ADHD research thrown in there because it's all just a big bag of what makes these neurodivergent people so different.
Yeah, to double down on that a minute, something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. I think the longer we do a podcast about ADHD, and like the more this is part of my life, and the more I'm raising with, the more I'm like actually raising children, and I'm like trying to raise them in a really in an environment where I know this is going to be part of their experience. I'm just like looking for things to like how do I make it easier on them than it was for me, and just I'm thinking about how I relate to the world and how I communicate. The less I'm sure it's just ADHD for me. Like I think we talked about this a while ago, which is like you think it's just ADHD, and ADHD I have the most the traits that get in the way the most for me are the ADHD traits. But the thing you said a while ago that I think about is sometimes when you get on medication, as some of the ADHD stuff is out of the way or just like less obvious or less present, some of the autism traits come out. And
I am just so consistent that I was about to say that to you until you just said it.
Yeah.
So I'm predictable.
That's right. I've noticed, and as we were like just kind of like reading through the topics we want to cover today, a lot of the things about special interests, I think really that it's a thing that for a while I was like, oh no, I bounce around too much as part of my ADHD, right? I'm interested in everything, but the more we talk about like the things that stick with you, I'm like, oh wait a minute, there are certain things like for example, music. I love music. I play music. I'm a very like patterns thinker, music thinker. That's been a part of my life. And it's a thing that I obsess over and have obsessed over and cannot let go. I do have other interests that do bounce around and kind of like rotate, but music and songwriting, playing guitar, like that's a thing that I just like it's more than I think just a hobby.
Well, and we're going to do some myth busting today because I think there's a general perception that hyperfocus is for ADHD and special interests are for autism, and hyperfocus lasts days to weeks to months, but it's very transient, and special interests are forever. And we have some research here that we're going to be sharing with you that shows that some of that is actually not the case for autism special interests. So should we just jump right into it?
Yeah. Let's talk to me about the research.
Yeah, let's do it. So there are a number of papers that look at autism special interests because, again, kind of common theme throughout our episodes, there's so many researchers that are like, why are these weird people so weird? Why are they so different than us? And they just want to understand our brains. But the interesting thing, as per usual, is that most of these papers don't actually ask the autistic people. A lot of them are focused on children who are autistic, and a lot of them question the caregivers and not actually the children themselves. So of course they come to these kind of funky conclusions. Like they say that special interests are the cause of social isolation because the autistic, generally kids, are focused on the interest rather than like social cues. And so this paper that I found I liked because it actually focuses on adults and it actually questions them and not the people around them about their own brains. So
Cool.
Imagine doing that.
So
So just to summarize that from the paper as well, a direct quote from them: most research evaluating special interest is focused on parent reports of autistic children and adolescents. However, clinical observations and self-reported accounts suggest that special interests are also of significant importance to autistic adults. You don't outgrow it. First-person accounts and smaller qualitative studies highlight that special interests are associated with positive outcomes for autistic adults. For example, a recent qualitative study asked young autistic adults to identify their strengths and coping methods. Participants reported that their special interests assisted with positive emotions and coping strategies and included skills or activities that induced a sense of pride. Other research indicates that special interests can be associated with increased social interaction, enthusiasm, and motivation.
so much of this is speaking to me. For one, I love that they're actually talking to autistic adults in this circumstance, and I like the way you mentioned that there's strengths in coping methods. So it's actually like these are things that can actually help us through life, right? Through our skills and activities, but also like to kind of circle back to something you said earlier around like so much of the research is done around kids and then like their caregivers. Again, as a parent of like yeah, kids who I'm certain I'm certain they're just between just with my life, my family history, I'm certain I have neurodivergence. Like I understand why there's a lot of like research on kids. Like it can a lot of times be really frustrating to have kids who are neurodivergent and cannot express themselves. It's hard to understand what they need, and some of that's a lot of that's gonna be out of their control. But as a parent, there's only so much you can do. So I totally get like wanting to uh why you would want to research that and find ways to help them. And again, I think this is the thing I always come back to is like, hopefully this research is done to find ways to help people and arm them with more information and arm them with more strategies. Sometimes that's the case, but often this research we're finding that isn't always the case. And it's also hard to like look only at the things the parents are doing for the kids because oftentimes if parents don't know they have a diagnosis or don't know what they're doing, they're gonna have different kinds of challenges. Um,
Precision matters here because, again, with some of these studies concluding that, like, oh, the special interest doesn't harm the kid, that can lead to sort of maladaptive treatment approaches where they're like, well, if we could just, get this kid to stop fixating on the special interest, then they'd have a social life, then they'd have friends, and so. I think to some extent this research can be harmful when they draw the wrong conclusions, and you're more likely to draw the wrong conclusions when you're not actually talking to the people themselves. So I can give an example. Obviously, I fixate on like medical research a lot, right? And I've had people suggest like, oh, do you have like hypochondria? Like, isn't that distressing? And I'm like, absolutely not. I very much enjoy reading about this type of stuff. And um, to an outside observer, though, if I'm reading about like brain scans and dementia or something like that could look really concerning. And they might think that I need to pull myself away because they aren't inside of my brain. And so that's where I kind of have a problem with a lot of these studies, not actually like asking the subject matter experts who
totally,
are the people, the subjects of the studies.
totally, right. And then at some certain aspect, like what's the problem? What's the harm? Like if you have this, and I get it, right? They're trying to say that it prevents you from having social skills. I don't know. I'm curious to find out if that's true. So, what did tell me about the participants? Who did the research and who did they recruit?
Yeah, so we can't necessarily draw any conclusions about children from this study because it is adults, but there's a lot of interesting stuff about the adults. So they recruited 687 adults through the Netherlands Autism Register. So this was a Dutch study. And this is a longitudinal online database of autistic individuals. So the sample was really fascinating to me. They had a mean age of 42 years old, with the men in the sample skewing a little bit older. They were like average of 45 years old, and the women were like 40 years old. And it was actually a very even split. They did a good job of getting an even split between men and women. So the average age of diagnosis was 35 for the men and 32 for the women. So typically these were folks who had been diagnosed like 7 to 9 years ago. So they were often late diagnosed folks and were somewhat comfortable in their diagnosis at this point. They weren't like freshly diagnosed or anything. And they also made sure to recruit participants with a range of socioeconomic backgrounds, employment status, and educational history. So a very diverse sampling. So what they found is that 65% of the total sample reported having at least one special interest, with 35% reporting no current special interests. So I found that that was kind of interesting, first of all, because I think we tend to think that people with autism always have a special interest. And obviously that's not true. And it can depend on the moment of time. I think it's probably not super common to be autistic and like never in your life ever have a special interest. But certainly at that moment in time, almost a third of the participants did not have a active special interest.
That's interesting. Like,
Yeah.
so first of all, it's cool that it sounds like this study, the fact that it had like a diverse population, it's like sounds like they are talking to a wide enough sample size for us to hear a good variety and find the things that are going to be statistically significant. That's going to apply to more people, which is awesome. And yeah, it's interesting. Like the fact that 35 and the sample is big. 35, it's not insignificant. So that's like, I'm wondering. I'm curious about that. Is that they maybe they didn't identify the special interest, or they weren't thinking about it, or how did that come up?
Well, they used the language no current special interest. And I think current is a little bit of the operative word there because, like, I'll go through phases. We've talked about we both have sort of Disney special interests. And so, and we can get into that more because Disney in and of itself, I think, has different flavors of special interest.
And this is more than just like in the Disney movies, right? Like there's
Yeah,
a lot more
I
to it.
actually
I'm
really
excited to
don't
talk
like
about.
Disney movies all that much.
So this will be
Yeah.
interesting to kind of unpack.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of different flavors of Disney special interest. So I in particular am really into the theme parks, and I care a lot about like the rides and like them constructing the rides and the animatronics. Like I actually started off in school. I wanted to be an electrical engineer so that I could work on the robotics in the rides, and so I don't really, you know, care for like Disney princess movies. That's like not, I'm not that into it.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the theme parks, and I think you get different groupings of like people who are into the rides, people who are and the theme parks and stuff. And there's like YouTube channels dedicated for people that are into that.
I watched that. I put those on. I watch all of them, and like regularly, we just have Disney park walkthroughs on in the background. Like that's
Yes,
just like,
yes.
yeah,
The Disney background
100%.
music, that's a specific group of people. There's
Yeah,
people that are really
absolutely.
into the Disney Cruise Line in particular. There's people who are really into like Disney Channel bumpers, like people who have uploaded like every commercial that has ever
Wow.
been on Disney Channel, right? Like I'm like, don't tell me those people are not autistic. And obviously people that are into the traditional animation and the movies and stuff. So you
Yeah.
get these like interesting clusterings of like not all sort of Disney special interest is the same. But at any rate, I will go through phases where I like want to watch those on YouTube all the time and I'm into the theme park history. And then I'll go through months at a time where I it's not the thing I want to click on. That's not what I'm interested in. It's kind of similar with like autism. That's definitely another special interest of mine. I'll go where, that's all I'll watch every day. Like stuff from like
Yeah.
autism content creators and the researchers and everything. And then I kind of lose interest and then I will go months where I don't want to touch it.
Interesting.
And so I think that that's actually based on this study, not atypical for
Wow.
autistic folks.
So as a kid, went through a lot of phases where I would like, be really into something for a while, and then like not be to the point where I have like vivid memories of my mom talking to either me about it and overhearing it too, of like how I was in like a certain type of like phase, like Thundercats phase, He-Man phase, whatever. And kids do that, right? Kids obviously get into stuff, but it feels like there was a God for a long time. It's still probably a Star Trek phase, but it is like it's like these phases where it's like I get really hyper fixated on it for a while, and I go deep and nerdy. It isn't just like, oh, I want to watch this thing, or I want to learn and read about this thing. It's like I got to get into the universe and live there for months.
When you hit on something that's very operative here. Some of the sites that talk about the less sort of stereotypical presentations of autism explain special interests as being something where you want to immerse yourself in it. And so
Mm,
that, I think, is the distinguishing factor from a hyperfixation, as well as, I think, the duration. So I'll go through phases where I'm into Disney, and then I'll go through phases where I'm not into it. But there's kind of been a through line. Like, I first got into Disney, like I did a report on Walt Disney in the 5th grade, and I could recite every fact about his life and like the exact dates when everything happened and all these things, which was funny because like I completely got missed as being autistic because they're like, little girls are into Disney, that's normal. But it
right.
wasn't like me sitting and wanting to watch the princess movies. It was me learning the biographical history of Walt Disney, and me learning like I used to go to the theme parks with my parents and think about crowd flow. Like, I was
That's
so
so cool.
fixated
Yeah.
on the crowd flow in Tomorrowland where they had bottlenecks, particularly during parades. And I would be like, how could you improve the crowd flow here? And actually, they recently did by tearing out particular rocks, and they're kind of blocking footpaths. And I would think about even like the crowd flow in the women's restrooms. It's very annoying because women will queue up and they won't check, like the doors will look like they're closed and they're actually not. And so you'll get a line of like 10 people in there, like open bathrooms. And so I used to think about this a lot. Like, I was like, this is a problem that shouldn't exist. So
Yeah.
obviously that's not like and I was like, in like elementary school, right? That's not like a necessarily a typical interest for an elementary school kid to be thinking about how you can improve crowd flow in bathrooms at theme parks.
Well, you're getting into the details, right? You're carrying out the details
Yeah,
and the mechanics in a way that's like not typical for your peers. And I think to add on to that, like you might argue, sure, everybody thinks about this stuff when it's a problem. If it's in their way, they're gonna worry about it. But I think it's one thing to be annoyed by a crowded bathroom, and another thing to think about the mechanics of crowd flow because it's interesting. It's an interesting topic.
right.
Um, what I'm wondering, what I'm like,
Interesting to some of us.
yeah, yeah. Well, God, this Disney, we can spend the whole episode, Tara, could be us talking, nerding out about Disney magic, like the engineering behind like all that stuff, like Disney cruises. Like we can go deep on this. There's plenty of lore. There's plenty of details. But as we think about special interests as they apply to other people, and you mentioned earlier like the idea that like the current special interests versus like the difference between that and hyperfixation. How much of did burnout come out in any of this? The thing I'm thinking about is like sometimes I'll get really into something for a long time and then you kind of burnt out. Sometimes it's like it is just like an ADHD like phase. Like focused on I need to learn electrical engineering this weekend, and I'll get really into it for the whole weekend, and buy all of the parts, and then go on Amazon, and like by the end of like maybe the weekend or the month, I'll have like a blinking light. I meant to build a robot, and I'll have like a little blinking light, and then it just sits there. Everything just sits there for a long time.
I think burnout is more common with hyperfixations. I think that the ADHD side of the house tends to burn brighter and faster and then kind of stifle, like it burns out, right?
Yeah,
Because I think the ADHD part is more intense. And so I
yeah,
think that's also kind of a distinguishing factor. I don't generally burn myself out with like Disney stuff, but I definitely burn myself out with like projects. And I think part of that with the hyperfixation side is you generally don't like come back to it once you've burned out. So I think that's another sort of line in the
yeah,
sand. As much as these are kind of a little bit blurry,
yeah.
to be
Well,
quite frank.
and to that point, I think as we talk about this, and anybody that's like listening to this and relating to any of it, I used to be hard on myself because like I wanted to finish things. It's like I have all these interests, and it used to like be really frustrating that I would have this idea, and I could see the path and the outcome so clearly. It's like I got to do this. I hyper focused on it, and I would get so far. Sometimes I would get 50%, sometimes I get 80%, and then just like drop the thing forever. And I used to be so hard on myself around like, why can't I just finish things? Why am I letting stuff go? Why am I like getting so into this thing? And then at some point, I just realized like it's okay to explore something for as long as like for as far as like to validate. Do I need to keep doing this? And
I
sometimes
always wish that like ADHDers could be paired with people who don't like to start things but like to finish things, because I do
yeah.
think that's such a common thing where like with ADHD you get the hyperfocus, you get 60 to 80% of the way there, but like the
Hmm.
last 20% is so hard if not impossible, because I think
Yes.
you've already gotten the dopamine hit of figuring out how the thing works, and so the execution is just not particularly interesting or challenging.
Yeah.
And if you remember there's a acronym for what grabs the attention of someone with ADHD. It's INCUP. So it's this framework for what ADHD people tend to focus on, because neurotypicals, it tends to be like very linear, like it's like they can time manage better and stuff like that, and this is why we can't. We focus on interest, novelty, challenge, urgency, and passion, right?
Yeah.
So when you're in the beginning of a project, there's a lot of novelty to it, there's challenge, there's passion, and when you're in the execution phase, the novelty is gone, you've figured out how to solve the problem, the challenge is gone, you've come up with the solution. And so I think the passion kind of goes as well. And so then it's like, what is there to focus on? And so then you're
Yeah.
kind of grinding up against like your natural tendencies, trying to get it finished, because the motivators are complete.
Yeah. And I think the thing that gave me a sense of like release or a sense of relief or like acceptance is understanding that like that's okay. Personally, like personal stuff, sometimes I just want to understand how something works. And that's totally fine. Some people read books, some people go fishing. I just want to understand like how something works. And that there's nothing wrong with that. And I think like we don't need to finish everything, and we don't need to like our hobbies don't need to, or just our interests don't need to become our entire identities. Now, where it gets into problems is when I have this like same enthusiasm and excitement at work, and I'm trying to like I have a project that maybe is assigned to me. I know I can do it even if I don't want to or like to, or it's my job, or I have an idea that I'm really, really excited about. And so I like start working on it with a team, and then I lose interest. And then so there's a certain amount of follow through where you have deadlines and you have stuff you have to get done for your job where it can become a problem. And that's where like knowing how to either push through that or how to make it novel again or have people that support you can really be helpful.
That last 20% is very challenging for me at work as
Yeah.
well. So let's talk about like what the most common special interests are based on this study. So men were more likely to report a special interest than women, interestingly, and men also tended to have a wider range of activities that they were interested in. They don't really know why. We'll get into shortly here potential explanations for why we have special interests in the first place. But it, like, spoiler alert, it's not super clear cut right now, but we do our best to pull together all the evidence that exists. Um,
Let
there
me
was also
guess. Let me guess. It's trains.
well, if you read some of the Simon Baron Cohen questionnaires, which we will get into later, you would think so. But actually, the most common special interests overall as a group were the topic of autism. I'm guessing that's why a lot of you are here, is you are autistic with a special interest in autism. Computers, gaming, and music are very, very common. But there was a bit of divergence based on gender. So for women, autism was number one. Women are the one that are actually driving up the autism as a special interest as the overall category. And that actually about 2/3 of our listeners are women. So that actually tracks with like our own statistics as well.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, Nature and gardening and art and culture are some of the most popular special interests for women. And then for men, computers and gaming, music, and computers and gaming was like off the charts. Music
Of
and
course.
bands, and then autism was number 3 for men.
Wow.
So the topics that had the biggest gender gap were autism, nature and gardening, and the human body or psychology, animals and arts and culture. And those were the ones where women showed a lot more affinity than men. Those are all ones that are just a lot more rare for men to have as a special interest.
That's fascinating. I wonder, it's like I definitely I relate to the music and bands one, obviously, like one I feel. The the nature and gardening one, that one isn't surprising. That makes sense. And culture, art and culture, I think is also very like fascinating for women. And but what I wonder is like the thing I'm just like kind of wondering about is to look through this, how much of that is like society pressure, like how much of these things are the acceptable thing for gender versus how much of it is a thing that you're drawn to.
I think the psychology one in particular is very much a societal thing. I think that's why that's a special interest of a lot of women because there's often less tolerance for women to not pick up on like social cues. And so I remember growing up, I kind of developed a special interest in a lot of this stuff. And obviously that's how we're here today. But even in
Yeah.
high school, I wouldn't have and so this is another reason why I actually think that maybe there isn't as much of a gender gap in terms of like having a special interest. I think that women might just not be aware that they have a special interest sometime. Because when I was in high school, I would have never said, "Oh, I have a special interest in psychology." But I used to go and read, like the Dear Prudence, like the advice columns where people would write in with a question, and they would give advice. And what I would do, I would read these obsessively, like for hours and hours and hours on end. I would read the question, come up with the advice in my head that I would give someone, and then I would
Wow.
see how closely it matched with what Prudence would say. And so I got very good at giving people advice because I literally like trained for it. But I wouldn't have called that a special interest, right? And that doesn't seem like not age appropriate. Like, really, the thing that distinguishes a special interest is the intensity of the interest and kind of the length of the interest. Because obviously, neurotypical people have hobbies, right? But they don't it doesn't become such a integral part of their identity necessarily. They don't sit and think about it for hours and hours on end per day. They don't necessarily want it to be completely immersive, right? Like
They
my
can
bath. Oh,
they can actually like put it down and walk away.
right. That's exactly right. That's kind of the line of where it starts to become a little bit more neurodivergent. And so, for example, my bathroom is themed after the Jungle Cruise ride at Disney. So it's like
We're gonna need a bathroom tour at some point.
so I have all these like I studied the queue for the ride and it's a fun line because they have all this like stuff from like the 1940s and so I have an Alexa that's put into like an old like a tube radio from that era and stuff like that and like it's I tried to make it look as like era accurate as possible. So like that's something that's like that's a special interest, right? That's not like a neurotypical like, oh, I like Disneyland. That's like, oh,
Yeah.
I really like the rides, right?
But you said
Um
something a minute ago though that I want to make sure people pick up on, which is you've gotten really good at listening to people's problems and giving advice. And we have a podcast. So anyone listening, if you've got a problem, send it in, write
we can do
us.
Dear Tara.
We're gonna do. We'll do. We should do it. We should do an email bag episode. So we'll look for those.
We can try our hand at being Dear Prudence, but that there the so I guess I kind of went on a little tangent there, but the thing that defines a special interest is the intensity, right? And the level of immersion and the sort of persistence of it, right? But it's not the topic. It can be anything. Anything can be a special interest. I've seen kids online who are into fans, like literally like ceiling fans, handheld fans, like It's completely random. I adore that. I think that's so cute. But like there's this like 7-year-old who got popular on TikTok because he just has like hundreds of fans, which is adorable.
Well,
But
this is the great
um
thing about YouTube now is like so much stuff is on there, and there are like channels now, and like the key to consistent content is like having a special interest that you can post stuff every week, and like there's some really like there's stuff that's like making puppets. There's like stuff on there that's like the little. Have you seen the little like the little food ones where it's like the tiny foods where like you mix and you put the powders and you mix it up and it turns into a little food. There's like cold like people make little things out of clay and people there's a whole channel where people are like making knives out of different materials. There's a lot of deep special interests
totally. But
on
I
YouTube.
think the some of the stereotypical female ones um don't catch attention because what is the end result if you hyperfixate on psychology, right? You get good at reading people. And so people think like, oh, she's just good at that. That's like a innate skill. And actually, it's something that's acquired through a lot of study, a lot of observation, and deep thinking on the topic. And so I think women themselves might not even be cognitively aware that they have a special interest. Like growing up, I didn't know that other people don't sit and think about things in the same way that I do, as deeply and intensely as I do. And so that's where I think there's a bit of that mismatch where researchers wouldn't necessarily peg it as an atypical interest. The autistic people don't recognize, and so that's my working theory for why we see that gender gap in special
Yeah,
interests.
and I think it sort of comes back to like the thing of like for a long time we thought that the researchers thought that ADHD was just like a boy thing because like there's the hyperactive little boys, right? But I think again it kind of comes back to societal pressure where it's like it's socially acceptable for guys to be into different things and like have to do stuff like do things to get away from their
It's more
families.
normal for adult men to have like a collection of like action figures, I feel like, than for adult women to have a collection of Barbies.
Yeah, right, right. And it should and like that 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 should be totally normalized. It shouldn't be like a yeah. It shouldn't be a big difference or gap between that.
Right. And that even is assuming that you buy into the idea that like there's something innate that would make a boy not like Barbies too. Right. Like there's so many layers of like societal pressures there that that could be a whole other conversation. Um but another thing I want to touch on here, to sort of bash some misperceptions, the majority of the sample indicated that they had more than one special interest and were not narrowly fixated on one topic. And remember, these are adults, right? So this is contrary to the notion proposed by previous research that special interests are in some way circumscribed or inflexible. There was no difference in overall subjective well-being or domain-specific life satisfaction between adult autistics who did or did not report having a special interest. However, autistic adults with a special interest reported significantly more satisfaction with leisure than those who did not. Both autistic men and women reported that these interests have a positive impact rather than an obstacle to functioning. So I think that it helps with your leisure satisfaction because they surveyed them across different domains of life. So leisure, obviously, it gives you a default activity to do. So I think that's why people with a special interest score higher in that category. But
You're
otherwise, there was no difference.
you're better at chilling.
Yeah. They did, however, find one negative trade-off, and that's if you focus on your special interest with like extreme intensity, like if you're at the very high end, then that can start to drop off in self-reported well-being. One can imagine if you were focusing on your special interest for 23 hours out of the day and you like couldn't bring yourself to eat or drink or take care of yourself, then that's where you start to get into potentially detrimental areas.
I could see that, and I could also see that impacting you psychologically if you have a special interest where skill and craft are valued, and you're comparing yourself to others. I mean, the thing I'm thinking about is like music, right? Where it's like you could be really into music, and that could be your passion and your interest, and like the thing that you care about, and spend all your time on it, but still not be very good for any number of reasons, or be just fine, or be good enough. But if you're but you might be holding yourself up to a standard, or comparing yourself to something that's even better, or that you admire that's just outside of your capability, then that could be detrimental, right? That could be psychologically very challenging and create depression, among other things.
Boy. Oh, should we talk about what causes special interests?
Yeah. So if these are special interests, then what causes special interest? Do we know? Do we know?
Yeah, I tried to read up on this as much as I could. I couldn't find any good brain scan type studies. Unfortunately, like autism research right now is very polar opposite. Like the thread that I was trying to chase down is that some studies have shown that autistic people have more synaptic connections than other people. And so you might have more depth of interest. But then I found a brand new study from 2025 that showed that autistic people have fewer synaptic connections, right? So it's like literally studies that are showing the polar opposite. And so I don't think that we can necessarily draw any sort of brain scan type conclusions at this point.
Then that leaves only one thing. It's vaccines and Tylenol.
That must be it. When you get the
yeah,
Tylenol vaccine,
Tylenol
then
vaccine
you are interested in trains and
it's making all these kids
happily
obsess
ever
over trains.
after. There you go.
I can't.
So that would be how some non-autistic researchers would potentially pose it. But there's a theory out there that was created by actual autistic researchers to explain autism called monotropism. And monotropism is a processing style or way of thinking, and it tends to actually do a pretty nifty job of explaining like a lot of facets of autism. So, and monotropism is also applicable to ADHD. That's something that's very cool about it. Is you are monotropic as an ADHDer, an ADHDer, or an autistic person. So monotropic people tend to focus strongly on a small number of things at a time and miss things outside of their attention tunnel. So it's like you basically have blinders on and you quickly forget things that you're no longer focusing on. So even, this might sound a little counterintuitive for ADHDers, right? But the thing is, when you have ADHD, you're not focused on things. You're very focused on whatever you are focused on. It's just that you don't necessarily have control over where that focus is being directed, and that focus can rapidly change. And so, but it's not like necessarily a lack of focus. And so that's where the monotropism theory comes in, is that ADHDers are monotropic, but with very little control over where the attention tunnel is going. And then autistic people have very strong attention tunnels. And actually, the initial monotropism research shows that if you're ADHD, you are more monotropic than autistic people or ADHDers.
Great.
So it's kind of cool. I score very high on this test, which we can link the test to take and see if you're monotropic. But
So excellent at rabbit holes and tangents.
Yes. And so basically, because you experience things so intensely and you have trouble shifting from one thing to another, that can result in more passionate interests with a lot more depth of knowledge. And I do think that there's something to this where, like, if you're able to focus on something enough that you have a depth of knowledge, and when I say knowledge, I don't necessarily mean just facts. Like, it could be knowing how to craft someone. Like, knowledge could be like a mechanical skill, a physical skill. Music would be another example. That's, muscle memory, right?
Right.
But we'll call that umbrella knowledge, right?
Sports even.
Yeah, exactly. I think special interests tend to be more satisfying when you have that sort of knowledge or ability, and so that there's probably some level of self-perpetuating that's going on there as well. So I think that the narrow focus kind of allows you to develop that.
And I think if it aligns with like a trade craft or like a profession or something you can do where that you can get like notoriety, or where it's acceptable, then maybe that works in your favor. Although it can still be challenging if you are like expert at going off on tangents and rabbit holes. I think where we can get tricky is if the thing is like counter to how you make a living, where you
It's
obsess.
challenging if your special interest does not align with a traditionally monetizable skill.
Right. Right. Well,
So,
okay.
so monotropism is kind of how we experience the world, right? Polytropism is how basically neurotypicals experience the world. So they're able to spread their attention among multiple things. And you think about like communication styles, right? This is how they are able to follow your words and your facial expressions and your body language and your tone of voice and process all of that all at the same time. But they are also not experiencing any one of those things as intensely as someone who is monotropic. Whereas someone who's monotropic will probably experience fewer of those things, but with more focus and intensity. And so that's where it can also get very overwhelming to be monotropic. And that's also why we tend to have issues with interoception, right? Like with our ability to perceive our own bodily states. Because if our focus is directed outwards, then you don't necessarily have that focus directed inwards about like, is my bladder full? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Because the focus can only go in one direction, right? It can only go one place until the alarm bells start going off and you're like, oh, I have to pee right now,
Right.
because it's so loud. And then you can't focus on anything else.
Well, and that's where like I think like, that's where some of the you lose track of time. You can't perceive time, right? Because you're so into it. But I think the important thing that you mentioned there is the intensity, and that's why it can be so overstimulating.
So we have another study to pull in. This one's from 2024, and it investigated hyperfocus and kind of monotropism in autism and
Oh,
ADHD. And so they gave out these questionnaires and how it pertains to how inattention pertains to quality of life and hypervigilance and negative thinking. So this was a sample size of 492 adults. It was some of them were ADHD only, some of them were autism only, some of them were both, and then there was a control group of 99 people, so pretty even split of all four of those groups. So they completed the questionnaire, and they found that hyperfocus and inattention were both elevated in all neurodivergent groups. So those aren't unique traits to either ADHD or autism. Hyperfocus and inattention tend to be common in both. And they're positively correlated, implying that atypical regulation of attention, sometimes manifesting in hyperfocus and sometimes in inattention, is what they called a transdiagnostic phenomenon. So basically, the more you have hyperfocus, the more you probably also have inattention. They're not opposites and they're not either or. They are actually probably very much interrelated. Now, hyperfocus predicted poorer global quality of life, more hypervigilance, more negative repetitive thinking, and more symptoms of anxiety and depression. However, positive experiences of hyperfocus mediated an indirect relationship between hyperfocus and greater quality of life, partially attenuating the overall negative association. So what they're saying there is that because you have this ability to focus so intensely, you can hyper focus on things that cause you anxiety, bad things in the world. You know, the globally the world is not doing so hot right now, and I'm sure a lot of us are kind of hyper focused on the news, or you have to like very intentionally pull yourself away, and so that hyper focus ability and sort of that inability to pull yourself away as effectively as neurotypicals can just sort of choose to not engage. And the fact that we repeat things in our minds over and over more commonly does actually lead to lower quality of life.
well, that sounds like I mean all the anxiety and depression stuff 100% relate to that. That also sounds like rumination to some
Yeah.
degree, but also from the positive side of things, the fact that like that monotropism and like hyperfocus are things that is like a neurodivergent shared thing. That's great. It makes me feel more camaraderie and community with people with ADHD and autism and like everything in between. And I think to that point, like I've had conversations, I've talked to people who don't even share the same special interest as me, but like we can nerd out about the fact that we have special interests and can go deep on things, and just like that shared empathy and understanding. There's something to that.
I think it's really nice when you can learn from each other. Like
Yeah.
that's a social dynamic that I very much enjoy. It's like, you teach me a bunch of shit and I'll teach you a bunch of shit. But monotropism is not the only sort of paradigm for how we can think about autism and ADHD. So for autism in particular, there's another framework. This one was developed by Simon Baron-Cohen, and it's called the Systemizing quotient. And this one's kind of weird. So you'll know all about Simon Baron-Cohen if you watch our episode on RMET, which is the eyes test. He has developed some very questionable autism theories. Unfortunately, he is currently one of the world's foremost autism researchers, which is unfortunate. Go watch that episode if you want to understand a lot more in depth who he is. But one of his other measures is this systemizing quotient. And I don't necessarily disagree. I think that autistic people do tend to systemize. However, he says it as a juxtaposition to empathy. Like, he thinks that it's a binary sliding scale, and the deeper you are in systemizing, the further you are from empathy. And so he has people through this framework take the systemizing quotient and the empathy quotient. And he says, if you're autistic, you're going to score very high on systemizing quotient and very low on empathy. The problem is the empathy quotient test that he developed really doesn't test empathy terribly effectively. It's kind of a bunch of random shit put together. And then the systemizing quotient, I'm going to read a couple questions to you from the actual test itself. So question number 1, I find it very easy to use train timetables, even if this involves several connections. As we hit on before, trains.
The pattern stuff I totally get. Like that to me sounds like a strength. And it's wild that he separated that from empathy.
Yeah. So so it's like, why would thinking about train tables make you less empathetic in the
How
first
does
place?
what does that
Really
do with
dumb.
anything?
It's just dumb. But the test as you go on as well, it's so niche and sort of stereotypical. So it's like, I like music or bookshops because they're clearly organized. When I was taking this test, I was thinking about it. I'm like, I don't go to like record stores and I don't go to bookshops, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't like being in spaces that are clearly organized. So he created this incredibly ambiguous test for people who tend to be very high precision. And so it's like, would you check no if you very specifically don't go into music shops? Like,
But Tara, like, let me tell you how wacky this is. I do go to record shops and music shops and bookstores and like boutique niche guitar shops. I do that stuff a lot. Let me tell you, they are not cleanly organized. There's a record store down the street from me that I love, and I go there. It's the person who owns it is like very likely neurodivergent. I don't know this, but the place there is categorization. Yes, there is a lot of like detail and categorization, but I would not call it a cleanly organized place. And I can't tell you how many books in bookshops, yes, can be categorized and organized.
But
But
it's like, I like going to Home Depot because they label the aisles. Like, it's like,
yeah,
what?
yeah, it's like there are categories of things, but I can't tell you how many music shops I've been into that are like not. There's like stuff is there. It's random. There's like stuff that is organized. You can find stuff, but then everything else is like spread out and random.
And you know, and it's sort of a very gendered way to ask as well, because you could equally say for like American millennial women, like, I don't like going into Forever 21 because they just lump all their clothes together and don't have clear sections about which clothes go where, right? Like, you know, but he makes it fit into very specific categories. I'm scrolling through here. There are several that hit on train special interests in particular. And so he very much, you know, and he's been criticized, right? He tends to research high IQ autistic men. And so it very much feeds into these stereotypes. And so his tests don't do well, particularly for like women who might not have, like, as we saw, there was sort of a gender dimorphism in terms of those special interests. And because he phrases each of the questions with the more stereotypical male interests, it sort of by necessity excludes women from the results. And he is the same guy who has put forth the extreme male brain theory, claiming that autism is a manifestation of an extreme of a male brain. But then he writes studies that sort of self-select for men to score higher.
So he's got a type. I mean, he's got a type. Look,
Yeah.
look. I don't want to kink shame. He's the way he's into. He's putting his calling card out there. That's his thing. I'm good with it. I'm good with it. But don't pull us all down with your bad research.
So this is kind of the problem, right? I don't think he's off base necessarily to say that autistic people tend to systemize. And I do think that a lot of special interests are a bit of a manifestation of that, where we tend to be very analytical. Like even when you think about stuff that wouldn't necessarily be categorized as like a system, like music. I think that autistic people who are into music have a very I don't want to say academic, because generally people are self-taught, but a very analytical way of thinking about that music. I think that sort of analytical thought pattern is common to autism, but it's just he layered on so much other shit that it's hard to wholesale buy into his theory.
Well, how does what does any of that have to do with empathy?
Right. It's like, what? So there's a slightly different flavor of this. This one was developed by Temple Grandin. She's a lot better. She's a world-renowned autism expert, and she herself is autistic. And she describes autism as a behavioral profile that has particular strengths and weaknesses. And she thinks that autistic people's thinking styles fall into one of three categories: visual thinkers, verbal and logic thinkers, and sort of musical mathematic pattern thinkers. And she believes every autistic person generally falls predominantly into one category, but could also have a mixture of like two or three. So I think that a lot of special interests fall into each of these categories and kind of tend to correspond. So I can rattle those off for you real quick. Visual thinkers tend to think in pictures and see things in very high fidelity, either in their mind or physically, in order to process information. Visual thinkers may have more of a photographic memory, and they're the type of people that can like take an object and like turn it around and just like you see it in your mind. You physically see it. So they have a brain scan of Temple Grandin herself, and the tract that connects the visual part of your brain to the motor skills in the frontal cortex is 10 times the volume of a neurotypical control, while the tract that connects auditory cues to visual cues is 1/10 of the volume of the neurotypical control. So her brain scan very conclusively shows that she is very much a visual thinker. So if you're not that, if you don't have a photographic memory, you might be a verbal or logic thinker. And so these people tend to be very good at learning languages and have an affinity for words, literature, and speech. They might make a lot of lists, might memorize mundane things. So this is where the train tables comes in, train tables and routes, stories in alphabetical order, software product codes, like sort of list type people. And verbal and logic thinkers tend to have a huge memory for verbal facts on all kinds of things. So these are your sort of trivia nerds. I probably fall more into this category. Like I used to have people growing up call me an encyclopedia because I tend to be able to just like rattle off facts about things with pretty high accuracy. A lot of people might hold a lot of facts about movie stars, sporting events, publications, history, geography, weather, sports statistics. And some people are very good at learning foreign languages, but they generally are maybe worse at drawing. And then the last type, this one might be you, is pattern thinkers. And so Michael Shermer defines this as the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless data. But it's music, math, pattern type thinkers are in this category. So for thousands of years, mathematicians have studied patterns in music, finding the geometry that can describe chords, rhythms, scales, octaves, shifts. So this is what I mean. It's still a sort of it's still a liberal art, right? And so we don't always think of that with like autism, analytical.
Yeah, this one is 100% me. Like, I love that one too. Like the whole patterns thing. Like I consistently worked on like design systems teams, but also like just the whole. What I love about the patterns in music is like music. It's just sound frequencies. Like it's just sound frequencies in space, right? And there's no reason for it to be music, but we found ways to categorize it and find scales and bring in. That's why it's music theory, because you can mix it up in different interesting ways. There's chromatic scales, but like there's there's a whole catalog of ways you can categorize these sounds that appear, or the sounds that happen in nature, into like all this stuff. And yeah, the patterns, like that's
So you're
it's
sitting and categorizing the music. So
yeah,
yeah, they
freaking
they
cool.
also and chess masters fall into this category too, because they don't visually see the moves. They sort of conceptually understand the pattern of the moves, but you're not like picturing photorealistically each move. So that's that pattern thinking. And people have put forth that autistic people tend to collect, and so I would say I think this is an extension of that, because collections aren't necessarily physical items. Collections are also a collection of facts, a collection of thoughts, right? And so I think that's all consistent with special interests.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Now, one other thing about special interests is that we often have what other people might consider juvenile interests, right? Like Disney adults get shamed on the internet all the time. And you even see this with like Love is Blind. Like some of the folks that star in that show have special interests around like the movie The Lion King, even though they're in their 20s, if I remember correctly. It's hard to find a ton of information on this. Some people I've seen lately on social media have been talking about something called asynchronous development, so I wanted to touch on that quickly. So this phenomenon of asynchronous development was first described by Lita Hollingworth in kind of the 20s through the 40s. She did this research. She describes this as having the intelligence of an adult and the emotions of a child combined in a childish body, and so that makes people encounter certain difficulties. And then Kathy Kearney, who is the founder of the Hollingworth Center for Highly Gifted Children and an editor of Highly Gifted Children magazine, has also published more recent literature on asynchronous development. But if you picked up from the name, it's generally talked about with respect to gifted children and not necessarily autistic children. And it's
Ah.
this idea that you develop your intellect a lot earlier than you develop social skills and things like that. Like everything else is age appropriate, but you're just highly intelligent. And so teachers have more expectations of you. Like, it's like, why is this kid having a meltdown over shoelaces when we were talking about, mitosis 5 minutes ago, and they're, 5 years old or whatever. And it's a lot of times kids that develop language skills prematurely for their age and kind of tend to speak like a thesaurus and stuff, which also goes along with hyperlexia. Now, I have a little bit of a problem with this framing, because I do think that giftedness is kind of a way for people to sometimes be in denial that they are in fact autistic. There's a lot of
Yeah, I could see that.
symptom overlap. But I don't think that this is a satisfactory explanation for why people with autism have quote unquote juvenile special interests, because this obviously doesn't cover the breadth of the autism spectrum, right?
But and by the way, when we're talking about juvenile special interests, we're talking about adults liking things that are probably kids' things, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about adults into Pokemon. We're talking about like collecting action figures, the Disney stuff, right? Uh, as if it's a problem, as if there's something wrong with that.
Right. That's what's so interesting about it, is that people do try and make it seem like it's a problem. Which brings me to, I couldn't find any research on this, right? And so I went to the next best thing, which was Reddit. But hear me out. I think people on Reddit actually had some very good explanations here. And one of them is just that autistic people may care less about societal pressure. And in fact, everyone might otherwise have juvenile interests if they weren't hindered by societal judgment. And I buy into that. I
Sure.
think that sounds reasonable to me.
Well, and I think to build on that too, there's also like the sense of comfort, right? You find certain things comforting, and in a world where you're like overstimulated and overwhelmed all the time, you want to gravitate towards a thing that's going to make you feel calm and grounded, right? So that might play into that. Not to mention all the stuff we're talking about earlier on around just the whole thing about monotropism and special interests and lore and diving deep into things and the mechanics of stuff. Like there's something to be said about craft and skill. And the thing you have to remember about things that are juvenile or considered juvenile someone is putting that judgment on there. Somebody is saying this thing is for kids, but it's still made by an adult. And that can be done oftentimes at a very high degree of skill and craft and precision, things that are worth appreciating. And so like, I think there are a lot of things that there's a lot of art that is made, and somebody has said this is, it's made for only kids, so people should outgrow it, I think is the subtext there. But
It
really
feels
it's
relatively arbitrary,
that's
right? Like that there's like, if you take music for an example, that particular artists might be more for young kids, another artist might be for more adults, and where does that distinction come from? I mean, it's arbitrary, right?
Well, and this is the thing, right? Because I think that there are some things that are made for kids in a cynical way, where it's like it's for kids, so it doesn't it doesn't have to be good. But again, as a parent, the best kids content are made at a high degree of skill and craft, and it's storytelling that transcends, that people relate to, because it's relatable to the human experience. It's not just the kids. I'm thinking like Pixar, right? Anybody, I don't care who you are, there's a Pixar movie out there that will make you cry, right?
Absolutely.
And Pixar is great because they don't dumbing things down for kids. They're making transcendent storytelling that kids can appreciate, but also so can adults. And I think there's a lot of examples.
Well,
of
and
that.
Pixar also has such a high degree of craft. Like, so I'm, working in software, right? Very into graphics. And so that was kind of what I specialized in college. And when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write a thesis on, this was like an undergraduate thesis, I was actually inspired by Moana, because they had done stuff with fluid simulation that was like nearly impossible. Like they always make some sort of technological advancement with every Pixar movie. And so I think Moana might actually be Disney side, not Pixar. But see, I don't have the film categorization flavor
It's
of
really
Disney
cool.
special.
Yeah.
but that inspired me, and so I wrote a thesis on rendering what's called incompressible fluids, which is water on a HoloLens, which is a wearable device on your face, so that you could
cool.
have water interacting with your environment in real time. That's obviously a pretty adult thing.
Yeah.
But someone just hears like, oh, Disney girl Moana, right? Like
Totally.
And so you kind of get that label too, even though it was like, oh, I was doing partial differential equations on hardware. And so I appreciate it for the craftsmanship there, because like truly there's a annual conference called SIGGRAPH about like visual graphics, and they always have researchers presenting papers on the latest movies about how they created like equations that calculate, like Merida's hair from Brave. They had to do the math behind like how springs work and modify it to figure out how to render curly hair. And that was one of the first examples of being able to render high fidelity curly hair.
Tara, we're gonna talk about this for another hour. Like this is one of my favorite things. If any of this is interesting to you as you're listening, let us know in the comments. What's your special interest? What do you dive deep on? What are the things that like help you prevent burnout when you're diving into this stuff? Like, what do you like? What do you like? What do you relate to? Is any of this hitting close to home? Let us know.
You saw it in action. Podcasters talking about special interest, and then we couldn't keep ourselves from not talking about the special interest.
Yeah,
this was a hard one to record.
It absolutely is. So yeah, if any of this is familiar or relating, let us know. And if you have a problem or something you're going through, we've got we'll do our open our mailbag or ask Tara segment. So
there you go.
Let us know in the comments. Write us in. Yeah, thanks for listening to this one. This was a fun one. It was good to catch up, and it's good to go deep on special interests and just get hyperfocus and lose track of time. And all of the special interests you were listing, I was like, each one of these could be an episode. Like this is
we should do something like that. If you guys want to talk about your special interests, it'd be fun to feature sort of the here are the special interests of our actual community.
Please do.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Bye.